Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm Vicki Chou of Counsel at Hueston, Hennigan, and a former Assistant United States Attorney. I'm also a board member of the Southern California Chinese Lawyers Association, and we are proud to be presenting this panel today in partnership with Cal-APABA as part of its series on allyship. I'm also grateful to the panelists for lending us their time and expertise on this important topic. Before we begin, a few administrative announcements. You should have received an email with links to written materials and an evaluation form. If you would like CLE for this session, please pay attention to the chat window for instructions. We are also running a poll for this panel. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there should be an area that says poll. Please answer the questions. This session is being recorded, but there's an option to answer the poll anonymously. We should have some time for questions at the end of the session. Please type any questions you have into the chat window. I'm joined today by Mack Jenkins, Assistant United States Attorney and Chief of the Public Corruption Civil Rights Section for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Central District of California. His section is responsible for investigating and prosecuting police overreach cases, as well as hate crimes. Manjusha Kulkarni, the Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, a coalition of over 40 community-based organizations that serve and represent the 1.5 million Asian Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County. Manjusha also serves as a lecturer in the Asian American Studies Department of UCLA. She began her career working at the Southern Poverty Law Center in her hometown of Montgomery, Alabama, and you may have seen her work in the New York Times, NBC, or the Huffington Post. And Brian Sun, a longtime partner at Jones Day and a nationally recognized trial attorney. He was a chief in the U.S. Attorney's Office, Deputy General Counsel for the Christopher Commission, the past president of SCCLA, and the past president and founding father of APABA. So let me begin by setting the scene with a few slides. For those of you who watched the first program in this series, the screen cap should look familiar to you. In 1991, now almost 30 years ago, Rodney King was brutally beaten by police officers during an arrest. It was captured on video by a bystander. In 2020, George Floyd was killed during an arrest in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was captured on video by a bystander. In 1992, after the police officers who beat Rodney King were acquitted at trial, there was the uprising, sometimes also known as the LA riots. Now here's a picture of LA in 2020. Back to 1992, here in 2020. It would be easy to conclude that very little has changed over the last 3 decades. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Sun to talk about his work on the Christopher Commission, a commission formed by LA Mayor Tom Bradley to undertake an independent examination of the LAPD after the Rodney King beating. We distributed the executive summary of the report as part of the written materials in advance of this session. The full report is pretty remarkable. It describes itself as blunt and plain-spoken, and it is. This paragraph in the foreword pulls no punches. Whether there would have been a Los Angeles Police Department investigation without the video is doubtful, since the efforts of King's brother to file a complaint were frustrated and the report of the involved officers was falsified. That's very direct. The commission also makes a pretty startling recommendation at the end of its report, to transition out the chief of police. Brian, what did you and the commission hope to accomplish? The report came out in July 1991, before the trials of the officers. Were you concerned about contributing to civil unrest?
Well, the reasons and the need for the Christopher Commission were pretty apparent, and I'm going to give you some quick history of context. And those of you who remember reading about this in the history books, or even some of us older folks who lived it, will recall that a lot of the examination of the relationship between police and communities and riots began in the 1960s. If you're going to do your Googling, you'd start with the Kerner Commission, which was a national examination of why there were riots in Watts, Newark, and Detroit in the mid-late 60s that led very similar images to what you see today. And in the aftermath of assassinations of Martin Luther King and the 1968 Chicago Democratic National Convention. That's the undercurrent of where we are today, and goes to the mantra that history does indeed repeat itself, which you'll hear me say many times today. Now, the LAPD that we came across in 1991, when Rodney King was beaten, was an old school paramilitary style operation with a command structure that started from the 40s and 50s, that if those of you remember all the riots with the Hispanic community in the 40s, onto the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where the growing movement of communities of color, largely African Americans and Hispanics, into Los Angeles created the context where the LAPD had to respond to communities of color, low-income folks butting up ahead against the middle and wealthy classes in Los Angeles. And the command structure, of course, leadership structure, William Parker before Chief Gates, had the same institutional mentality, very much one that did not tolerate people of color in terms of and engage in discriminatory practices towards these communities when they started moving towards what we might call today the inner city. And so this is the LAPD that Warren Christopher and the commission dealt with. And I will say this about Warren Christopher. As a young lawyer, he worked on yet another one of the commissions that investigated the Watts riots, a commission led by John McCone, former head of the CIA, a state commission study by then Governor Pat Brown, Jerry's father. So this historical context shows, again, that a lot of these commissions had studied this sort of police interaction with the communities, but had not yet really touched on how they could improve and make meaningful recommendations, effective recommendations to improve on those relationships and avoid some of the kind of tensions and problems we face to this day. Now, Los Angeles is worth mentioning in special, because like Minneapolis, which is amazingly diverse for a Midwestern city, Los Angeles was a growing melting pot by the early 1990s. And that created some significant problems, not just between the African Americans and police, but between the communities of color themselves. Those of you who know history know the LaTosha Harlan's case, which preceded Rodney King, where a Korean American shopkeeper shot a young African American girl, which led to extreme tensions between the African American and Korean American and APA communities. And that was, and I would refer you to John Ridley's Let It Fall documentary, which talks about the period right before the Rodney King incident and some of those tensions, which I'm going to address later today when we talk more about the impact of COVID-19 and some of the rhetoric going on today, like Kung Flu, which I think is setting the tone for possible hate crimes for our community. When you're talking about the context here, again, the Christopher Commission came about through the stellar leadership of Warren Christopher, who as a young lawyer, I said, worked on the McCone Commission, which really didn't do that much. And Warren was faced with a daunting challenge. This was a citizens commission. They needed to raise money. They needed to get a group of commissioners that could lend credibility to the findings of the report. He needed to get a huge staff in place overnight and to develop the analytical structure for how we were going to come at this institution, which for decades was buried in these practices of discrimination and indifference to people of color. And what was interesting about this is that in accomplishing that, Warren, I think, set a time frame. We had 100 days to get our report out. More than 200-page report that tackled everything from Rodney King to the department's internal command structure and practices, their own lack of diversity in leadership positions, hiring, promotion of minorities, as well as the most important aspect, which I think, came out of the commission, which is the concept of community policing, which today resonates in a lot of cities. Now, I will tell you that besides examining the actual King incident, the commission, which again was diverse, they were not all anti-cop, some were pro-cop in the sense of philosophical approach. They did not want the LAPD to be dragged through the mud, that kind of thing. But I can tell you that after hundreds of interviews done by numerous deputy general counsels, of which I was one, and quite frankly, from a racial profiling standpoint, I was the Asian guy on the commission, because there was a recognition of the growing Asian immigrant presence in the city, and the need to have more bilingual officers to deal with those immigrant communities. But the thing that struck and appalled the commissioners to the end, even those sort of more inclined to want to be supportive of the LAPD and Chief Gates, was the racist and the offensive messaging that they found on the internal LAPD internal communication system. You know, when you're a squad car, you can type some stuff up, even back in the early 90s, about when you're going to report to a call to a scene. And what really appalled the commissioners, what I think really shifted and turned their attention towards really coming down harsh on Chief Gates and the command structure, was allowing the recording of what these officers would say. And you look at those text messages, it's pretty offensive stuff. Now, ultimately, the commissioner's recommendations were sweeping, but they didn't get adopted right away. A year later, after Sergeant Kuhn and a bunch of others were acquitted in a state court prosecution for their acts that started the uprising, as some would call it, it took a while to get these reforms in place. In fact, years and years. But today, the LAPD is different. Today, the LAPD is different in many respects on excessive force policies, community policing. It has set the standard. And while it's certainly not a perfect organization, they really have integrated a lot of the reforms recommended by the Christopher Commission, which I think can be helpful for other cities such as Minneapolis, which is considering a similar commission. Now, I'm going to end here by saying that when we did the investigation, many of us, it was like a sprint, or being in trial where I'm out there every night with cops. And I have to tell you that I got a perspective on this from both African American and Caucasian police officers I spoke to, that people have a tendency in this context, in this era of George Floyd, have to understand. When you're a cop in the field and you're dealing with a suspect who you think's on drugs, who's bigger than you, and you're coming up there and trying to arrest, the mentality of the cop is you're in a fight. It's either me or him. If he hurts me, I'm going on disability, and what's my family going to do? This is the perspective of a police officer approaching a suspect. Now, does that mean he should wail on the guy, put your knee on the neck for 8 minutes? Of course not. So this goes to training, experience, things like that. But when you have young officers who don't know what the F they're doing, it's a tough situation. Now, the recommendations still focus a lot on how to deal with these kinds of training and the excessive force disciplinary structure. But you know, for us, it was a lot in the field here. For anybody talking to these cops, is you had to work on breaking what we call the code of silence. These cops did not want to talk to us. They feared retaliation by the force if they were candid with us. But somehow we were managed to break through and I think get a sense of what this was about. And I guess what I can say in ending is, you know, it was a tremendous experience for me. And the coolest thing I did was on the night of the incident, the citizen was taking a video of the beating, but there was a light shining down on the beating, so that from a helicopter above. So the guy actually took a video with the help of the LAPD spotlight. And I got to go up in the helicopter with the pilot who was on there that night, who just happened to be Japanese American. And I got to interview him, and he told me about the whole thing. So that was an interesting thing I got to experience during that investigation. And I know we have limited time and I could talk forever, so I'll shut up now and move back to you, Vicki.
Thank you, Brian. I'm glad that you talked a little bit about how the LAPD looks different now, because I chose, for purposes of sparking discussion, pictures from 1992 and 2020 that look the most similar. But in reality, things have changed. Oops. You know, people recognize that the protesters this time were largely peaceful. Even prosecutors are saying that they're not going to be criminally charging them. But I want to move now to talk about police accountability, since that's a major part of this discussion. Even as people are talking about police reform and decreasing the over-policing, quote unquote, of our society, people are calling for police accountability. And this is a memo from a coalition of nonprofits addressed to Mayor Eric Garcetti. And the very first point is launch an immediate investigation on LAPD use of force on peaceful protests. And here is an article from yesterday from The Cut. When will Black women see justice? Again, calling for the accountability for something, justice to be had for prosecutions of these cops. So Mack, this is your section. You are the section that polices the police. What is happening in that space?
Sure. First, thanks, Vicki and Scala, for having me and inviting me to this very important and obviously very timely panel. And thanks to the other panelists for contributing. I think there can be no more significant conversation than the one we are having here today with you guys, and that's going on, even more importantly, throughout the country in different spaces and with different stakeholders. And that's a good question, because I get it a lot from my boss, from the people I supervise as the chief of the Public Corruption and Civil Rights Section, from my friends, from my family. What are we doing? As you mentioned, one of our authorities is we police the police. Here we do public corruption and civil rights. So I say we don't just police the police, we police all forms of power, federal, government, local, state. It's a weighty responsibility. And I can tell you one that when it comes down to it, is one that often is never easy. We don't make a lot of friends. We often make enemies, people we often work with. So it's a difficult job. What's important now, though, is people recognize that where in the space we are right now, our job is very necessary, not just for the sake of our careers, but for the sake of our communities and for the cities we live in and for the nation at whole. They need someone to trust. They need someone who they can rely on when something goes poorly, or even when they're just not sure. A perfect example right now, and it somewhat relates, is there were two recent hanging deaths of African Americans, Robert Fuller in Palmdale and William Malcolm Harsh in Victorville. They died by hanging, and it initially didn't get any attention. But because where we are in this space right now, people don't trust local police. They want to make sure that those hanging deaths weren't something more horrible, more horrific. And they had good reason to ask those questions, because both of those local cities had trouble with racism, had trouble trusting their local police departments. So what's different now, and one of the things we are doing, is we are doing more proactive outreach, whether it's law enforcement, potential violations against protesters, which we'll talk about, or a hanging death that people want to make sure was not a hate crime. So almost immediately, once we got wind of it, we combined with the Department of Justice Civil Rights team in DC, the FBI, we opened up investigations into these hanging deaths just to make sure they are what people were saying they were, at least the locals were saying they were, and to get those families answers and to get those families some sort of restored trust back in the system. That is not the type of activity you would see 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when people wanted the feds to stay in their lane and people didn't want federal inquiry, didn't want big brother federal government overseeing the police or getting in on local matters. Now people realize that we do have a value to play, and that's you're seeing a role to play. And that value that we add right now is you see a lot of stories about protester violence, but you also see a lot of stories, as you pointed out, of peaceful protests and either instigators or infiltrators who will come in and try to transform a peaceful protest into something violent, or law enforcement, as you mentioned, overreach. or criminal activity by law enforcement trying to deter or punish protesters. We have regular meetings now. We are regularly overseeing and have an intake process for any complaints that go to social media, that go to local police departments, anywhere in the 7 counties that we oversee where someone is complaining that at this peaceful protest, someone intervened and made it violent, or law enforcement responded disproportionately. So we, including the U.S. Attorney, Nick Hanna, one of the first U.S. attorneys to issue a press release, not simply about this civil unrest, but actually the results of law enforcement's activity in either creating violent scenarios, or we've batoning protesters, rubber bullet protesters, or citizens who are engaged with peaceful protesters. Seen articles about pointing guns at protesters, pepper spraying protesters. So these are citizens against citizens, where now this is what gets our attention. It's not that there's a civil unrest. We, the federal government, need to stop the unrest. We need to protect the unrest. The protesters have a fundamental First Amendment right to protest. And that is something that has been very, very significant to us. We have a lot of people paying attention to those things. And again, sort of to the original question, what are we doing? We're doing a lot. And I think what's most encouraging is a lot of these local governments, as I mentioned before, who would have been hostile to us asking questions. Let me see that video. Let me see that report. Now want to, because they get the sense of the urgency where they want to sort of have us vet things. They want to have us support them. Because if they don't turn those things over, we have, through our grand jury process and other ways, we will get those reports. We will get that information. And we'll ask tougher and harder questions if a local entity is not being cooperative. And I will say, to Brian's point, the LAPD literally looks very different than it did in the 90s and definitely in the 60s. And the responsiveness of their staff, of their leadership. There's a lot of former AUSAs over there, the Director of Constitutional Policing at LAPD, whose job it is to make sure the police officers operate within the bounds of Constitution. Used to be my boss, Liz Rhodes. These are people over there that they're putting in place that care about civil rights. And so I think it looks different, it acts different, still has some ways to go, but I think that has been encouraging to me, to when I reach out and call someone at a local police officer station, that they are not hanging up on my face. So that is a big difference.
Thanks, Mack. And I know that you and I are both proud that we hail from the office that prosecuted the cops who were acquitted of the Rodney King beating in their state trial, as well as pursued the LA sheriffs, like Sheriff Baca in those cases. So that's encouraging to hear. Let's transition now to something a little more depressing, which is hate crimes generally. And as discussed in last week's panel, the position of Asian Americans with respect to hate crimes can be complicated. In some cases, might be a bystander. In some cases, the perpetrator, as Brian mentioned with the Letitia Harlan's case, and in some cases, victims. So AppCon has been doing a lot of work in this area, and I'd like to turn it over to Manju now to speak on this.
Hi, thank you so much, Vicki. And if I can ask you to pull up the slides as I begin, I want to thank SCCLA for inviting me to participate in this important event. So what I wanted to talk about is our work at AppCon, next slide, and what we've seen over the past several months. So across the United States, there's been a real emergence of COVID-19 related hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And so first I thought I would share with you a few incidents that are emblematic of what we've seen across the country. On the left, you'll see an individual who reported that his elderly parents were taking their child on a walk, and some individuals drove by and shouted racial epithets at them, leaving them feeling very unsafe, especially with their grandchild. The middle incident is of a refusal of service. An individual who was traveling before shelter in place and was unable to get a ride from the Oakland airport. And then the last one of a professor who recently sent an email to students calling COVID-19 the Wuhan virus. So these, as well as others, and I did want to just mention one additional one as we move to the next slide, which is an incident here in Los Angeles where a child in a middle school was physically attacked and verbally assaulted. He was accused of having COVID-19 simply because he was Asian American, told to go back to China, and when he said he was not Chinese, he was punched in the head 20 times. This was in early February before there was a single incident of COVID-19, a single confirmed case in the Los Angeles area. So on March 19th, AppCon with Chinese for Affirmative Action and San Francisco State University launched Stop AAPI Hate. It's available, the incident report form, in several Asian languages, which you can see there, as well as in English. We've really tried to do outreach to immigrant and LAP communities, and really combined to have a 150-year history serving AAPI communities from AppCon, CAA, and SF State. Next slide, please. And just quickly, in terms of the data, wanted to share with you that we have received in the first 8 weeks over 1,800 incident reports from across 45 states in the District of Columbia. Most of the reports involve hate incidents and not hate crimes. About 58%, 59 come from California and New York. Women are experiencing hate at about 2.5 times the rate of men, and about 9% of the respondents are seniors. We are the leading aggregator of this data. I understand that a few other organizations, including Advancing Justice in DC and OCA, have been collecting this. And I think they have a 100 or so, up to 200, and about 35 respectively. In terms of what the lessons are, we know that this is a widespread problem. It's taking place in areas where there's significant populations of Asian Americans, but really no place is immune. And what we also know is that vulnerable populations such as women and the elderly are being targeted. Next slide. And so what else do we know about the data? In terms of the types of discrimination, you'll see here, the vast majority involve non-crimes. Those are verbal harassment incidents. About 10% involve civil rights violations, workplace discrimination, and refusal of service. 8% involve physical assault. These are most notably cases where someone is throwing a bottle, a can, maybe doing pushing, something like that. Most of these are non-actionable. And so what we know from this data is that even with shelter in place, we are seeing a significant number of incidents. These are taking place at grocery stores, pharmacies, big box retail, and in neighborhoods, which you'll see on the next slide. Related to businesses, which take up about 50% of all of the incidents in terms of sites of discrimination. Public, parks, sidewalks, and transit make up about 30% combined. And the graph on the left shows this really is a problem affecting all Asian American communities, but of course the Chinese American have been hit the hardest, with incident reports coming. 37% of our incident reports come from Chinese Americans, followed closely by Korean Americans, others who just identify more broadly as Asian, then Vietnamese and Japanese. And then the last slide I want to share in terms of our data is a new report that we've released about anti-Chinese or anti-China rhetoric. So what we've seen of the 1,800 reports is there's very virulent animosity against or toward Chinese Americans. About 38% of cases involve profanity, verbal assaults, and taunts. Scapegoating is significant, where about 32% are blaming China or Chinese people as a source of disease. Anti-immigrant nationalism with 20%, parroting of terms, including what we know this weekend of President Trump calling the virus, instead of COVID-19, calling it the Kung flu, also using Chinese virus or Wuhan virus. And then finally, Orientalist or racist depictions showing or describing China and Chinese people as dirty, diseased, and holding strange dietary habits. The last thing I'll say before I close this section is just that this actually follows some recent polling. The Ipsos poll found that 30% of all Americans have witnessed someone blaming Asian Americans for COVID-19, and 60% of Asian Americans have witnessed someone blaming our communities for the disease. And similarly, the Harris poll has found that 75% of Asian Americans in the United States are concerned or worried that they too will become targets of this type of hate. So I'll stop there in terms of the data, and happy to share more as we move along.
And if we look at our own poll, that Harris data poll tracks pretty closely to what we're seeing with our participants, which is that 71% fear of becoming a target of COVID-related hate incident or hate crime because of race or ethnicity, even though very few people actually have experienced something. So Brian, this panel was actually your idea. You said, as you mentioned in your first segment, that history repeats itself, and you said that you've been preparing for hate crimes, which, as Manju just described, incidents are on the rise. Why did you have that sentiment?
Well, in the context of history repeating itself, you know, I have to say that going back to Manju's point, it hits you when it's close to home. And Chris has, Mack has a former colleague who works with me. His mother is Malaysian Chinese. And recently at a Walmart or a Target, she was accosted by a white couple blaming her for COVID-19 and harassed her and walked her out, chased her out to a parking lot, and really made her feel uncomfortable till a Latino couple drove up on a truck and helped her shoo them away. So that strikes you home, even when it's close to you and you hear about these incidents yourself from people you know. But today, Mike, what I want to talk in the few minutes I have left is basically a call to arms for the people on this call. In the historical context of the APA experience, history tells us about the Chinese Americans who came in the 19th century to the US to face exclusion acts, discriminatory laws that would not allow them to vote or own land. And you look at the immigration laws of the United States, a lot of the law that's made was brought by Chinese Americans fighting for their rights in the immigration courts and in the courts in general. And we had our share of hate crimes and lynchings and beatings and incidents, whether it was during the railroad building in California in the late 19th century to the yellow peril of the 1920s, the Red Scare of the 1950s, where Chinese Americans were under surveillance by the FBI constantly, thinking they were Chinese communist plants and moles. Continuing to this day, where the same thing is going on. And that's just a Chinese experience. The Japanese American experience, we all know from their coming to the United States in the early 20th century, the relocation camps in the 40s, which still indelibly are on the minds of the third and fourth generation Japanese Americans. But what I want to talk about with this group is how hate crimes impact you as lawyers or people with that experience. For us, let's just face it, the APAs are not well organized. We don't have an NAACP. We don't have a Martin Luther King. We don't have a Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. We don't have that kind of leadership on issues of civil rights and never have. We have had some organizations like Manju was referencing, OCA, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice and ALDEF in New York, some legal community service organizations that have been around since the mid to late 70s and early 80s. But we really haven't got on our act together. I was going to use a different word, but.
Well, Brian, what about Vincent Chin and APABA?
Yeah, so now I was going to get to the fact that hate crimes have unfortunately been the catalyst for us getting together. And the people that sort of got us together on the legal end were struck by, affected by, impacted by the June 19th, 1982 murder of Vincent Chin, where you notice the date is the same date as Juneteenth in Tulsa, ironically and tragically. Because up till then, we had a bunch of fledgling bar organizations like SCCLA, JABA, CABA, you know, in LA, and we did some stuff together, but really we weren't together. And that incident, which resulted, as many of you may know, in the beating death of a Chinese American design engineer by 3 unemployed auto workers who thought he was Japanese. And during the incident, the last words that Vincent Chin was reported to have uttered were the words, "This is not fair." So interestingly enough, the establishment of NAPABA grew out of the Vincent Chin incident. There was, in fact, a very striking, eerily similar experience. 3 auto workers were tried and given probation as state court action, which raised a big hue and cry in the Asian community, particularly the Chinese community, which led to a DOJ civil rights prosecution, criminal prosecution, much like what Mack's office did in the Rodney King case. For good or for bad, these guys were convicted in the trial level, but the Sixth Circuit reversed their convictions, and the amount of jail time and whatever for those 3 individuals was minimal. But it signaled to the Asian Pacific Americans that we needed to get our act together, at least on a bar level. Hence the founding of NAPABA, where I finally recall, there's videos on this, 16 of us gathered in a conference room of a law firm in West LA in 1987. We went to the ABA in 88. In 89, we founded NAPABA. 200 people attended the first conference. Now we have over 1,500 that come, and we're a national organization of over 75,000 lawyers. But we can do better than that. NAPABA is active in civil rights, but we have to do more. And it's interesting because the people who founded NAPABA were the young Asian law students who went to law school in the 70s during the affirmative action times and all that stuff. And it's those folks that grew up to be lawyers like you are who started NAPABA and are carrying the mantle forward because of a hate crime incident. And I see the George Floyd thing as being another one of these benchmark incidents in our history, where the only silver lining I see is taking meaningful action in terms of growing our understanding of police in the inner city, but also with the communities ourselves. The APA community and the African American community and the Hispanic community don't always get along. Our people live with each other. And I fear another Latasha Harlins incident, or I fear some other kind of incident that would involve our communities of color hurting each other in hate crimes. You cannot rule that out, particularly when in the uprising you had Korean American shopkeepers with their shotguns on their rooftops ready to shoot African Americans coming to loot their stores. Now we need leadership on this stuff. And the George Floyd tragedy has resonated with everybody, including my daughter, who's an 11-year-old adopted biracial African-American Caucasian girl. She wanted to get out of the car and go protest, my 11-year daughter, okay? So these are things that we need to wake up and step up and not just watch MSNBC, CBS, or Fox News talk about it. The generation of leaders that started NAPABA or who sought redress for Japanese Americans who suffered incarceration and relocation camps, the Dale Minamis of the world, my generation, we can only do so much. And the message I would have for everybody on this call is, look, we can use this benchmark in the silver lining for this country and make our contributions towards changing attitudes and the impact of understanding what's going on in our community. We need you guys to step up. And I can't even emphasize that more. And one anecdote I say, and I'll end this here, is 25 years ago, when Justice Breyer was up for confirmation in the Supreme Court, there was an organization of Coalition of Bar Associations of Color, and we all testified at the confirmation hearings. And what I told Senator Kennedy, or whoever was the chair at the time, I said, look, and Biden might have been on this committee, I don't want to have my son or daughter come back here a generation from now and ask this committee why there isn't an APA on the Supreme Court of the United States. And that's 20-something years later, 25 years later, and there's still no APA on the Supreme Court. We need to do a lot better. We need to make our voice heard. And we need to have you folks who are listening to this seminar or webinar, or whatever it is, to step up. Everybody can do something. You don't have to commit yourself and become a public service lawyer, but you can do something. You can speak up, you can participate. And when you have a situation as we have now, with COVID-19 and rhetoric from various people, private and public officials, blaming China, using terms like Kung Flu and China virus, and you got Pete Navarro making statements blaming everything on China, on business and trade, and then you ultimately have guys like Steve Bannon, who basically have publicly pronounced that the George Floyd murder can be directly attributed to China. Directly attributed to China. And what he says about this and how he gets to that point is unbelievable. You know, he basically says that China is exporting fentanyl. Fentanyl was found in George Floyd's blood, and basically is saying that were it not for China, this guy would not have been murdered because he was in there trying to pass a counterfeit bill in a store where the counterfeit bill was probably made in China. You can read the article. It's the kind of stuff that we're going to have to deal with, and it's going to get somebody to go murder or hit or hurt a Chinese or an Asian American because they buy that bullshit. So we got to be ready for this. We need to stand up, have our voice be heard, and you know, the founding of the APABA came out of Vincent Chin. This benchmark event involving George Floyd and America re-examining their soul when it comes to race relations is an opportunity for us to step up and make things better for our community. So I'll leave it at that, Vicki. Thanks.
Ryan, thank you for the call to arms. But in this discussion, as with the police accountability discussion, there's that part of it that is about what law enforcement is doing, right? With Vincent Chin, people felt like his killers were not held sufficiently accountable. So here I'm going to go back to Mack to talk about prosecution of hate crimes.
Yeah, I think a lot of what Brian said resonates, right? And it's with a lot of minority communities. In 2009, barely 10 years ago, James Byrd in Texas, an African-American man, was basically captured like an animal by racists, tied by his feet and hands to the back of a truck, dragged for miles to a gruesome death. No question about who did it. No question about why they did it. No question that he was brutally killed. But somehow that was not a federal crime. There was no, DOJ tried very hard to figure out what they could do to charge it. Because he wasn't necessarily using a federally protected right under 245, there was no statute that really covered why he was killed in order to make it a federal crime, certainly a state crime. But the fact that the DOJ's, this federal knight in shining armor supposedly couldn't charge such a racially charged crime that could devastate the country, reignite racial tensions, was sort of paralyzing. So in that scenario, and in addition, when Matthew Shepard, a gay man in Wyoming, was essentially led and ambushed by people at a bar, found out he was gay, led him on as if they wanted to hang out with him, and ultimately ambushed and murdered him. Again, no question who did it, no question why, not a federal crime. It took people stepping up, like Brian is calling people to do now. And now 18 USC 249 specifically covers both of those acts. It's the Hate Crime Act. Why it took until 2009 for there to be a federal hate crime act is probably a subject for another panel. But it can happen. So sort of to bookend Brian's point, these are things that happen. People got fed up, disgusted, threw up, whatever it may be, and took that call to action, made those things happen. And those are 249 is a very significant statute for us because it opens up our arsenal as the federal government to look at things. We don't have to, it isn't as jurisdictional. We don't have to be creative about interstate commerce or was it related to a federal protected activity? Was it a hate crime? Did someone get hurt? We can look at it. And again, right now we're in a scenario where people want us to look at it. People care. So I think the sort of call to arms I am seeing people answer is not just seeing something on social media and just saying, oh, that's bad and doing nothing about it. They're sending it to their representatives. A lot of the cases we get referred to right now, again, the protesters, even the hanging deaths. Right now, there's an Asian woman and an Asian family in Torrance that were threatened. It's all over the news because one was exercising in the park and the other family was taking their kid in the park. And a Caucasian woman threatened the kids. Why are you here? No one wants you here. Go back to whatever Asian country you're from. I'm going to harm you or your daughter. I'm going to get my family to. Back, 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't have looked at that, probably wouldn't have heard about it. Those victims probably wouldn't have done anything about it because luckily no one was actually harmed, at least physically. But now that's getting a lot of attention. The DA's office, I know, is looking at it. The FBI is looking at it. So there are people now that because these things that people are sick of living with, sick of seeing on social media, and having those soul-searching conversations of what they want the America to look like, the America they were promised. To us, it's a lot of that. Videos, reporting it, getting it to us, and we now have some tools to take action. I'm proud to be a part of that charge because we absolutely are listening. We absolutely care, and I think that is a part of it. Showing the community we actually care. When you send us a Twitter post, we look at it. I send it to somebody. FBI looks at it. We get IP logs. These are things that people really care about now, and it's definitely not the final step, but it's the first step of responding to that call to action that I think Brian passionately evoked.
Thank you, Mack. It's heartening to know that law enforcement cares about these issues, but as you mentioned, that's just a first step, and there's only so much law enforcement can do, and that's partially dictated by what the law allows them to do. So I want to turn it over to Manju to talk more broadly about what else we as individuals or as a society can be doing to address these incidents.
Thank you, Vicki. If you can pull up the slides where we left off. So we have a four-pronged approach at Stop AAPI Hate. That includes the reporting center, which I mentioned, where we are collecting data from individuals. We also are providing resources, which I'll be sharing in a minute, as well as looking at offering direct assistance to individuals who have been harmed through potentially mental health referrals, legal clinics, etc. And I think the last piece is really important, which is advocacy. We've seen through the protests how important advocacy can be, whether it's in the streets or it's with our legislators at local, state, and national levels. Next slide, please. And so what we're specifically doing in terms of that advocacy is looking at enforcement of civil rights statutes. So in terms of public accommodations, what opportunities are there? We know so many of the incidents are, again, not hate crimes, but cases of refusal of service, workplace discrimination, verbal harassment. Similarly, looking at housing and workplace discrimination and what protections are offered there, as well as in healthcare settings. You may have read the numerous articles that are about doctors who are getting themselves discriminated against either by supervisors, coworkers, and sometimes also being verbally attacked by their patients. And I want to point out too, because this is so important, because I think understand today that law enforcement is not always the answer, right? And part of the reason is that we know that unfortunately, even with hate crimes, they too often get disproportionately meted out against communities of color. That's part of why we also have a mass incarceration system in which so many African American men are behind bars, because we see that our laws are not getting enforced equally in the criminal context. I do want to mention that when we look at hate crimes enforcement. We need to have additional outreach to LEP and immigrant communities. There is a bill right now, AB 2235, which seeks to increase reporting by local law enforcement. A state auditor's report in 2018 found that for a 10-year period, only 14% of the time were local law enforcement officials reporting hate crimes to departments of justice and AG's offices. So that's obviously problematic. What's even more concerning, though, is that 50% of the time, local law enforcement did not even identify something as a hate crime. And I'll tell you, it was mentioned earlier that there was a stabbing in Midland, Texas. That was not identified as a hate crime, even though the individual said, "I want to kill Asians," and he stabbed a family of Burmese individuals. We've seen it time and again where law enforcement is reluctant and fails to report or identify, rather, hate crimes as hate crimes. So we need to do a lot more training of personnel and also look at the issue of prosecution. While 82% of typical crimes get prosecuted, only about 50% of hate crimes are prosecuted. So why is that? In terms of individual levels, Vicki, if you can go to the next slide, I wanted to offer just a few things of what we can do as individuals. So here are 5 things to consider if you've experienced hate. Obviously, seeking safety, staying calm, taking a breath, limiting eye contact with the aggressor or perpetrator, speaking out if you feel that it's safe to do so. Oftentimes you can go to a manager if it's in a restaurant or grocery store, share your concerns and what has happened, seek help from bystanders, and also to seek emotional support, because these types of events are very traumatic. I've even been on panels with individuals who've, just in going to Target and being accosted, being told to go back to China has caused them to not be able to go back to Target, understandably so. Next slide. And so too, I think it's really critical that in this moment, we need to, was there one additional slide? Yes, how to help. So it's important that we serve as upstanders to really help individuals if they are, if we witness hate. So we can take action, helping the targeted person. It's actually one back if you can go to it. Actively listening, ignoring the attacker, thank you, but really using our help to provide assistance and accompany the individual outside of the setting, again, outside of a grocery store, a business, and to offer that emotional support. Because as I indicated, the data shows that 60% of Asian Americans have witnessed someone discriminating or accusing Asian Americans of spreading COVID. And so it's so important that we do this in this time. So as I close the last slide, I just want to ask folks, if you have experienced an incident or you've witnessed one, to please share that with us on our reporting center. We use it to work with local and government agencies to deal with this problem. I've also had an opportunity to share the data with the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. I've shared it with our city attorney and DA's offices, and also to do pro bono work. If that's something that you're interested in, just yesterday I spoke with attorneys that were part of local APABA offices, one in Hueston, one in the Bay Area. And so if that's something that you would be interested in doing, to please let me know. And just to reiterate what Brian said, which is so important, I think right now we really need to call out white supremacy in all of its forms. And to serve as allies. I think you may have seen there are a number of folks from our communities, including myself and my family, who protested, over the past several weeks. There are Asians for Black Lives that is out there, and really understanding our history, as Brian indicated. And I want to just leave you with 2 thoughts. One is that We know from 9/11 that there was a significant backlash just from the 3,000 lives that were lost. For 10 years, Sikhs, Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians experienced hate incidents and hate crimes, as well as problematic policies. Now we're at the 120,000 death mark here in the United States. And finally, the fact that many of us would not even be in the United States if it were not for civil rights leaders who, after getting their civil rights victories, pushed for the Immigration Act of 1965. I know my family wouldn't be here without that act, and so many others across the country would not be here were it not for their leadership. So it's now time for us to pay it forward and to be outspoken for their lives as well as our issues. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Vicki.
Oh, thanks. Thank you, Manju. We have one quick question and then I'll close. Someone asks, are there any books about the Rodney King acquittals and the Christopher Commission that you would recommend?
Well, there's a lot of stuff online, reports that were done on the impact of the Christopher Commission. I don't have them handy here now, but you can Google and see them on reports of how the Commission's reforms over time had some material impact on the LAPD. You can just find them by Googling that. And there's YouTube videos, a whole bunch of available stuff that's out there on the internet. Vicki, I want to add one thing, if I could, to Manju's comments. The importance of gathering hate crime statistics is important. I belong to an organization called the Committee of 100, which is a group of Chinese American leaders in business, academia, science, research, politics. Governor Locke from Washington, Shel Kwan, Yo-Yo Ma, they're all members. And we're committed to this notion of something very important here, which is furthering the assimilation of Chinese Americans into U.S. society and to promote better understanding between the two countries. For the Committee of 100 and other APA organizations, this is a huge, huge challenge in this current environment. It is a benchmark event. And what C100 and other groups are doing are trying to reach out and organize in the way that they did after Vincent Chin, after the Wen Ho Lee case some 20 years ago, where they can, when they speak together with that unified voice and are coordinated, there are people in Washington at the senatorial level and state level, local city and county leaders who will listen to that kind of organization. And on the issue of stats and gathering crime statistics, there's no better organization than the Anti-Defamation League. They are the best in the business at it. And we're seeking to align ourselves with them to try to improve our gathering of statistics so that the incidents at Target and Walmart can be documented all the way up to physical altercations. So I can't emphasize the importance of that, and I just want to add that because at the end of the day, loyalty is what's under the undercurrent to all this. The Department of Justice, which we didn't have a chance to talk about, has a China initiative directed and targeted at what they have perceived to be Chinese Communist Party-sponsored programs designed to subvert and steal U.S. technology and call into question the loyalty of thousands and thousands of Chinese Americans who do cross-border work and research that in the COVID-19 context, we should be really emphasizing, not making polarizing statements about China and COVID. So I want to throw that out there because this is a difficult time where Asians are viewed, particularly Chinese Americans, are viewed as not loyal to the United States. And that's an undercurrent and basis for a hate crime. So I want to just throw that in there, Vicki. Sorry.
Thanks, Brian. And I think, one of the other takeaways from this poll result, especially when you look at it compared to the actual numbers that Asians across America are experiencing, are that this group, as attorneys, we are in a privileged position. Only 5% have experienced something personally. And so I take, and I hope you take Brian's call to action seriously. So we're at time. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today and to our panelists for their time. Remember to follow the instructions from the chat box if you would like CLE credit. The next panel in this series will be on Thursday from 12 to 1:30 p.m. on police reform with George Gascon, former San Francisco District Attorney and former LAPD Assistant Chief of Police and candidate for LA District Attorney, as well as Professor John Rappaport. And I think there's someone else who was added recently. So this is definitely one I'm looking forward to, and hope everyone else joins too. Okay. Thank you.
For the opportunity.